Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this model Seder. Thank you for being here. Very excited and looking forward to delving into what a fun, exciting, and spiritually uplifting Seder looks like. Hope everybody's doing okay. Sorry I can't be with you in person together. But as the old saying goes, bodies divide, souls are united. So we may be distant physically, but we are spiritually and soulfully and socially very much connected. My name is Rabbi Teldon. I'm the assistant rabbi and program director here in San Antonio at the local Chabad Center. It's an honor and a pleasure to join you today for a model Seder as we jump into understanding what is perhaps the most celebrated Jewish event in modern history, today throughout the States and throughout the world, and throughout Jewish history. This is the Jewish holiday that is most responsible for bringing together Jewish families to celebrate our heritage, the birth of our nation, which is what Passover is all about. And it all happens in the Jewish home. So while we can't go to synagogue today because of the current coronavirus COVID-19 crisis, celebrating Passover in the spiritual epicenter of Judaism, which is the home, is very much part of the theme of Judaism and of Passover and of COVID-19. Stay at home and protect your life, protect the life of others. So there is a famous passage, before we jump into the actual step-by-step of the Seder, there's a famous passage in the Haggadah, which you're probably familiar with, and it goes, B'chol dor vador, in every single generation, chayav adam liros es atzmo, a person is obligated to experience, to observe, to see themselves, ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim, as if they personally left Egypt. We ought to look at ourselves as if we experienced the Exodus today in our generation. What's that supposed to mean? Furthermore, there is another passage in the Haggadah that says that if God, Ilu lo hotzia kadosh baruch hu, if God Almighty, the Holy One, blessed be He, had not redeemed us from Egypt, us, our children, and our children's children would still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And the question is, and all the commentaries ask this, is what exactly does that mean? Would there not have been a revolution? You had a bunch of Jews together kvetching and complaining that Pharaoh is enslaving us. You don't think we would have thought of a way to break free? In fact, just 5-6 years ago, there was the Arab Spring, there was a revolution in Egypt. We would have been gone a long time ago. What is this business that we are slaves and our children are slaves and we have to see it as if we left Egypt? There's the old, reminds me of the old story about the Israeli and the Egyptian who are having a discussion about freedom of speech in their respective countries. And the Israeli says, in my country, we believe very strongly in freedom of speech. If I wanted to, I can take a cab to Jerusalem, stand right in front of the Prime Minister's office and shout, Bibi Netanyahu is an idiot. And nothing would happen to me. And the Egyptian says, same is true in my country. If I wanted, I can hitch a cab to Cairo, stand right in front of the residence of the Prime Minister and shout, Bibi Netanyahu is an idiot. And nothing would happen to me. So, what does it mean that we each spiritually have to consider it and experience, and that's what the Seder is all about, as if we personally left our spiritual Egypt? It reminds me of a metaphor shared by the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement in the late 1700s, and he shares in his magnum opus, the Tanya, a metaphor. It's a story of love between two individuals, reciprocal love. When somebody showers you undeservingly, with unconditional love, you are left with no choice but to reciprocate and return that love. The person's love overwhelms you. And the only natural feeling, as King Solomon writes, as water reflects the one looking into it, kamayim hapanim al panim, you shine and offer that love back. And the metaphor is of an individual who is down and out for whatever reason, is destitute, and is considered a riffraff by everyone else, a commoner, and he's sitting in a pile of garbage at the edge of the city, no one paying much attention to him at all, and suddenly none other than the king of the entire country, comes and lifts this fellow up and hugs him and embraces him and showers him with unconditional, undeserving love. And while all the guards and ministers and high-ranking officers are watching this, the king brings this commoner, unbeknownst to anybody, with no specific or unique traits. The king brings him into the palace, one chamber, another chamber, a deeper chamber. The guards are going crazy. No one's privy to go there. Into the king's most innermost chamber. And again, the king hugs him and kisses him and shows him tremendous love. Can you imagine the great, intense feeling of love that this commoner now has for the king? The king showers him with love. The commoner, the simple peasant, now has an intense feeling of connection and relationship with the king. Well, so it was with the Jewish people in Egypt. For 200 years they were enslaved. Many of the Jewish people, the Hebrews as they were called at that time, were idolaters. And yet, God, the infinite, the King of Kings, supreme being, transcendent, swooped down and cuddled the Jewish people with love and showed them miracles and took them out of slavery and brought them into his innermost chambers at Mount Sinai and gave them his beloved, cherished entity, which is the Torah, mitzvot, the Torah being the divine kiss, the words of Torah, the mitzvot being the divine embrace. You can imagine how the Jewish people felt then. And so it is, my friends, every single year at the Seder, this is what we are re-experiencing. We may feel alone, we may feel destitute, we may feel forgotten, we may feel uncertain about what the future holds. But let's remember that at any given moment, we have a relationship with God, the King of Kings, undeserving. We have at our fingertips the ability to study God's Torah, to do a mitzvah, to act kindly towards another fellow human being. That is cherished. We are cherished in God's eyes. We are never alone, and that's what it means to truly be free. You can be imprisoned figuratively, literally. You could be on lockdown. You could have no human interaction and connection physically with someone else. But remember that we are in God's embrace. We are in the inner chamber. And that's what a traditional mystical Seder looks like. And the rabbis, the sages, thousands of years ago, in the times of the Great Assembly, the men of the Great Assembly, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem during both temple eras, they codified, they ritualized this process of spiritual freedom and redemption in what's called a Seder. Seder literally means an order, a structure, parameters. There are 15 steps that they ritualized as part of the process of redeeming ourselves, liberating ourselves, tasting what it's like to be embraced by the divine. And so we'll get to the 15 steps in just a moment. But first, let me share with you what is on the Seder plate. No Seder is complete without the 6 items plus that we find on the table. Since I'm quarantined, all I have is this game. It's Velcro. The kids throw ping pong balls on this, or Velcro balls. So this is the Seder plate. It's got 6 items on it. The first one is the egg, the hard-boiled egg. This is actually a real one from my refrigerator. And it symbolizes the Korban Chagiga, the traditional annual festival offering. The next we have the zeroa, the shank bone. The shank bone, this is from my kids' toy kitchen. The shank bone is symbolic of the Passover offering, the Paschal lamb, which we don't have a temple, we don't have an altar, we don't eat it. It's purely symbolic. It stays on our Seder plate, and it's not to be eaten. We also, the third item on the Seder plate is maror, the bitter herb. I don't know why my kids' kitchen didn't have horseradish, but many use grated horseradish or romaine lettuce. And that reminds us of the bitterness of what it was like for our ancestors to be slaves for Pharaoh in Egypt. The next item on our Seder plate is the charoset. This is the best thing I could come up with, which is basically a mixture of pears, nuts, wine, apples. It's a little sweet appetizer. And it reminds us, the texture of the charoset reminds us of the mortar, the bricks that our ancestors suffered with to build these cities for Pharaoh. We also have the vegetable on our Seder plate. It's called a karpas. Many people use potatoes, onions, parsley, and that is something that we will later on dip into the salt water. We have another bit of maror called a chazeret, the bitter herbs or horseradish or romaine lettuce, and we'll get to that, why we use that in just a few moments. Obviously on the Seder table we have the matzah. We have 3 matzahs, preferably shemura matzah, handmade matzah that was baked specifically by humans who have consciousness, not robots or machinery, who can have the intent, the kavana of baking matzah specifically to fulfill the mitzvah. And we also, of course, have 4 cups of wine on the Seder table. We'll get to doing a little l'chaim in just a few minutes. So, let's begin by singing the song of the 15 steps. It's in your Haggadahs. We'll be using a specific Haggadah, and in that Haggadah, it is on page 4. But if you're at home or watching this, you can use any Haggadah. And so let's sing together. Let's see which tune. There's the tune I grew up using, and then there's a more universal tune. I grew up singing Kadesh Orchatz Karpas Yachatz. Let's sing it goes like this. How does it go? Kadesh Orchatz Karpas Yachatz Magid Rachza Motzi Matzah Maror Korech Shulchan Orech Tzafun Beirach Halel Nirtzah. So that's the 15 steps. Let's jump into it. The first step is called Kadesh. We pour our first glass of wine. Of course, we have 4. We fill it up, and we make the kiddush. The kiddush, for the first cup of wine, you can find in your Haggadah. Again, in this Haggadah we'll be using today, it's on page 5. And we sanctify the day. Kiddush or Kadesh means to sanctify. In Judaism, sanctify shares the same root with the Hebrew word to be removed, something that's distinguished or distinct or separated, to be transcendent. And just like every holiday, and in fact every Friday night, every Shabbat, every Saturday lunch, when we make the Kiddush on a glass of wine, what we are doing the consciousness, the meditation of what we're doing is we are inviting God into our lives. We are saying that up until now it was mundane, but now we want to harmonize the spirit with the physical, and reminds me of the old quip that to be spiritual, you just have to know two rules in Judaism. The first one is there is a God, and the second rule for spiritual living is you're not him. So the Kiddush reminds us that everything comes from God. God has even chosen our struggles, our uncertainties, our circumstances, as difficult as they may be. And it's up to us to recognize and bring sanctity and meaning and purpose to our struggles and to our lives. By making the Kiddush, we remember that God is always at our side. God is giving us both the struggle and the strength to overcome that struggle and develop a deeper relationship with God. That's the first step. If you want to attain freedom and liberation, invite God into the picture. Make Kiddush. So with that, let us make the two blessings of Hagafen and Shehechianu. Are you ready? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Okay. That Hagafen was for real. That Shehechianu with God's name was for educational purposes only. Otherwise, I would not have said God's name in vain. All right, moving right along to the second step. Ooh, that was good. L'chaim. Moving right along to the second step in the order of our Seder, in the process and the journey of spiritual liberation. We have what's called orchatz. Orchatz means we wash our hands, being that we are going to be dipping a vegetable into water, into liquid, which even throughout the year, if we do that, it's tradition, it's customary to wash our hands beforehand. Tonight, we're extra careful to do that because we want the children to inquire. We want them to start asking questions. Judaism is all about being engaged, not only with our hearts, not only, of course, with our actions and our behaviors, but it all starts from up here. When we're engaged intellectually in our faith, it's a whole different, meaningful, and deeper kind of faith. So, we wash our hands. We don't make the blessing, al netilat yadayim. We save that for the other future step in which we'll wash our hands before eating the matzah. What is the spiritual significance of washing our hands? One of the steps towards spiritual freedom is we've all messed up, we've all made mistakes in life. And instead of blaming others and pointing fingers and saying that person's got to fix their ways and this person's got to apologize and that, in Judaism you take personal responsibility, wash your own hands. You work on your side of the street, that person, it's up to them what they're going to do with God. God has his own calculation of their deal. But we got to do what's in our hands and wash our hands and seek perfection, seek reconciliation with others, and take personal responsibility. The third step is we dip the vegetable. It's called karpas. We dip the vegetable in salt water. The salt water obviously being the tears of our ancestors. And the thing about bitterness and tears and how this is all tied into freedom, spiritual freedom, is that very often we as humans have the tendency to avoid pain, to avoid unhappy times. And we null it and we dull it with eating, overworking, TV, whatever it is, instead of actually going through that emotion. Passover says, stop. We're going to do this. We're forced almost to taste the pain so that we can overcome that struggle. We move on to the fourth step in the Seder, which is called Yachatz. We break the middle matzah. So you take the middle matzah out from the stack of 3 matzahs, you break it a middle, a bigger piece and a smaller piece. The bigger piece is saved for the afikomen. That's the one that's hidden. That's the one that the children are trying to find. And the smaller piece, which is symbolic of the poor man's bread. A poor person never eats a whole loaf of bread or a whole piece of matzah. They're always saving for the next day. This is the bread of affliction. So to remind us about how our ancestors ate the poor man's bread, and to keep us humble, we break the matzah and we recite the Haggadah and the story, the narrative of Passover over poor man's bread, which we'll talk more about matzah later. But the idea is, you want to be free? Break the ego. You know what ego stands for? Edging God out. Edging God out. Be open. Be sincere. Be transparent. Be humble. We're not in control. We are not God. And to be free means to hand myself over to God. To embrace the uncertainty. To embrace the fact that I am not in control. To be happy and content and have a pure and heart with unadulterated faith and content that I am in God's hands. That's truly liberating. The next step is called Magid. We're up to the 5th step of the Seder. Magid means to relate, to share, to tell the story. The word Haggadah comes from this word, to tell the story. As the verse tells us, and this is another biblical mitzvah that we fulfill on Passover at the Seder's, V'higadata levincha. It's a mitzvah the whole year, but particularly on the eve of Passover, to share the story. Sharing stories is a big part of Judaism. We can all remember sitting with our parents, our grandparents. Some of us were even fortunate to live together with our great-grandparents and hear what it was like in the old country, and how with meager means, but with a pure heart, our ancestors served God to the best of their abilities, even in the most trying times. And so we too can leave our own personal Egypts. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which shares the same root as the Hebrew word Meitzar, which means restrictions, confinement, limitations, borders. We all have self-imposed limitations. I am not that type of person. I can't do this. When this happens, I'll be able to do that. When this person changes, and breaking the matzah and sharing the story of our own ancestors, redemption from slavery, both spiritual, physical, mental, emotional slavery to redemption. It inspires us by sharing their story in the Haggadah, which we're about to do, to break out of our own personal spiritual Mitzrayim limitations. How do we do that? We share the story. We ask questions. We get engaged. Of course, who's the one who asks the questions in the beginning? It's the children. They sing the Manishtana. So let's sing that together. And that could be found on page 8 and 9. Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol haleilot shebechol haleilot anu ochlin chametz u'matzah halayla zeh kulo matzah. Halayla zeh kulo matzah. Why is this night different than all other nights? First question is, all other nights we eat leavened or unleavened bread. Tonight, only matzah, only unleavened. This second question, shebechol haleilot anu ochlin she'ar yirakot halayla zeh maror halayla zeh maror. On all other nights, we eat all kinds of vegetables. Tonight, we're just eating bitter vegetables. What's the reason for that? Kids want to know. Third question, שבכל הלילות אין אנו מטבילין אפילו פעם אחת, אפילו פעם אחת. הלילה זה שתי פעמים, הלילה זה שתי פעמים. And all the nights, I don't see you guys dipping your washing your hands or dipping your vegetables in liquids. The kids want to know, how come tonight we dip it twice? Once we dip the potato or the onion or the parsley in the salt water, and also later on we're going to dip the matzah in the charoset. Why? Fourth question, Shebechol halilot anu achlim ben yoshvinu ben misubin, ben yoshvinu ben misubin, halayla ze kulanu misubin, halayla ze Hulanu misubin. And all other nights, you eat. Sometimes reclining, mostly sitting up. Tonight, we're reclining a lot. What's the reason? Of course, the reason is we're reclining like royalty. We're not slaves anymore. We're free people, free to serve God. We also have the 4 sons, famously. There's 4 different times in the Torah where the Torah addresses how to relate the story to a child who asks, what's the reason for all these customs in the night of the Seder? And because each time the question of the child is phrased differently, it's not one child asking it 4 different ways, it's actually 4 children. Actually, it could even be one child. You have to know at that moment the child's asking where they're coming from, how they're asking, why they're asking, and then you know how to package the answer. Then we have the Avadim Hayinu, which is on page 12. Avadim Hayinu, Hayinu. Pharaoh b'Mitzrayim, b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Avadim Hayinu, l'Pharaoh b'Mitzrayim, b'Mitzrayim. And now we are free people. Ata b'nei chorin, b'nei chorin. We have the time that we always look forward to as kids, where we take our cup of wine for the 10 plagues. Many have the custom to pour out the wine at each recitation of one of the plagues. Others take their fingers and dip it in, one for each plague. And the idea is that we don't feel triumphant, victorious, and happy to see the suffering even of our enemies who tormented us for centuries. We spill out a little bit of our wine for each plague. Yes, we recognize the miracles, the blessing that it was for us, but it was also tragic, and it's always important, as much as you celebrate, to remember that others are suffering. So we do that for Dam. You can find this on page... let's see, where is it? It's on page 13 and 14 in the Haggadah we're using. Dam, blood. Tzvardeya, frogs. Kinim, lice. Arov, wild beasts. Dever, diseases, pestilence. Shchin, which is boils. Barad, hail. Arbe, locust. Choshech, darkness. Makat bechorot, death of the firstborn. We have the famous song on page 15, Dayenu. And of course, you know the message in the lesson of Dayenu is to be happy and content with whatever you have. There was once a Hasidic fellow named Mendel Futterfass. He was in the gulags. He was sent by the communists, the Soviets, to the gulags for teaching Judaism, spreading Judaism. And when he was released many years later, I think he sat for 18 years. He was a mentor to the yeshiva students, first in London and in Israel and in New York. And he used to share many stories, speaking of stories in Haggadah. And one of the stories he shared about his experience in the camps was that he was always very happy, no matter what the circumstances were. And people around him, understandably, in the camp, in the gulag, were not so happy. And many of them were professionals. They were academics and writers and journalists and doctors, professors. And they said, "Why are you always so happy?" So in typical Jewish fashion, what did he answer? He answered with a question. He said, "Why are you guys always so sad? They said, well, what do you mean? I was about to finish my book and I was about to discover some new scientific research and now nothing. And he said, well, that's the difference. My whole life has always been about serving God. I can serve God here too. Yes, I have to adapt a little bit, but I'm happy with everything. Wherever I am, I can do what God wants of me. That's the lesson of Dayanet. With whatever we have, we're happy. God's in control. We're just showing up and doing what God wants with us in those circumstances, as trying as they are. Dayanet is a great lesson for us today as we are all quarantined and physically disconnected. Be happy that we have a roof, we have a home, we have food, we have people who love us and care for our well-being, and many of our ancestors who were also suffering difficult circumstances would have loved to have the conditions which we are fortunate to live in as we go through our crisis in our time. Now we drink the second cup of wine at the end of the section of Magid, so L'chaim. And then the sixth step of the Seder, we're getting close to the food. Everybody loves that part. The sixth step is, again, we wash our hands before we eat the matzah. We have to remember constantly, washing symbolizes purity, refinement, introspection. To be free, we can never peak. We always have to climb higher. The moment we become stationary and content, it's like an escalator. If you just stop where you are, you're going to go down. You have to constantly walk and grow and journey. Keep washing your hands. By the way, it's a good idea with coronavirus to keep washing your hands. No one's going to complain if you keep washing your hands during the Seder. But spiritually, what this means is be mindful. Live with intent. Be conscious of every single day. Make an effort to grow spiritually. Put effort in. Study some more Torah. Do another mitzvah. Meditate. Connect to God consciousness. Connect to our inner soul. You don't have to change. You just gotta retreat inward and connect to that very real place in which we are in touch with the infinite. Finally, we have the first real part of the eating part of the Seder, which is the motzi. And that's step number 7. It's on page 18 in your Haggadah. And that is the blessing that we make typically on bread. Tonight it's on matzah. Baruch atah Ado Elokeinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And at the Seder, with the 3 matzahs, you try to hold all 3 matzahs in your fingers, because the tradition is that we make the blessing on 2 whole loaves of challah, if it's a Friday night, or 2 whole matzahs. The middle matzah is broken. So we gotta hold the bottom matzah, the top matzah, and the middle matzah is sandwiched in between. For the next step, which we call matzah, step number 8, we have motzi and then matzah. We actually drop the bottom matzah. Drop the bottom matzah, just hold the top whole matzah and the middle small matzah, cut matzah, fragmented matzah. And the idea here is that to truly experience freedom, we have to experience both the humility symbolized in the middle matzah, which is broken, and the wholesomeness of the top matzah, which the complete matzah, which symbolizes what it's like to celebrate and to enjoy freedom. Once we've become connected to the divine, and we're no longer living in this delusional attachment to the material, life takes on a whole nother dimension of wholesomeness, of living wholeheartedly. So there's a duality of consciousness, of energies happening at the Seder, and that's truly the duality of everyday conflict of eating humble pie, of feeling fragmented, of feeling distant and like a unsuccessful person, but at the same time feeling the richness and the joy that comes from being wholesome and complete in our faith, in our relationship with God. There is a Hasidic tradition that there is an intense, magnificent, infinite spiritual energy that's embedded in the physical dough of the matzah. When we eat matzah, the Zohar, which is the magnum opus of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, teaches us that the bread, the matzah that we eat at the Seder, contains within it not just symbolism, but actual, real, intense, explosive spiritual energy, and it's called the bread of faith. We are me'est faith. We're eating emunah. We're eating trust in God. Our body digests and absorbs spiritual energy. It's a spiritual vitamin. Matzah is a spiritual boost to our soul. And it's also called the bread of healing. Matzah brings healing. Eating shmora matzah in particular, the night of the Passover Seder, brings our physical body healing. That's how powerful it is. The next step is, by the way, we lean to the left when we eat the matzah. The next step is the maror. We eat the bitter herb. Not your uncle Herb, who was a bitter guy. We eat the bitter herb, the horseradish, or the romaine lettuce. We dip it in the charoset, not too much. You don't want it to be too sweet, but you shake it off a little bit, and you eat a fistful of maror, if you could, of horseradish. Let it all out, cry, don't worry about it. It's once a year, twice a year. The idea, why are we trying to remember bitterness? We should try to be happy and free. Reason why we remember the bitterness, where we taste it physically, is to get into that consciousness of what it's like to be bitter. The secret of Jewish survival has been that we never forgot the past. We always remember what it's like for our ancestors and for us to experience pain, to experience oppression, to experience inner conflict. Because when we let ourselves experience pain and we remember what that's like, we can yearn. We have hope. We're optimistic. We work towards a better time. That's why we dip it in the charoset, because we want to dip the bitterness into sweetness. Bitterness on its own, despair, depression, stay far away from that. But it's healthy to have a little bit of guilt, a little bit of remorse, I should say, a little bit of bitterness, only when it inspires us and it has a taste and a remnant of hope and of optimism. That's the charoset, the sweetness of the charoset. Then we have the korech sandwich. So in the olden days, they actually had the Passover lamb, slab of meat, the matzah, and the maror. It's a great sandwich. Nowadays, all we have is the maror and the matzah. And we eat it just as Hillel the elder, Hillel the great in the times of the temple, it was his sandwich. He was the sandwich guy, and he invented this tradition, which has become part of the Seder. It's called korech, the sandwich. And the idea is, spiritually, that we have a different mindset now. You see, in the Egypt slave mentality, the world is fragmented. Life is basically just a bunch of tsaris, a bunch of chores. It's a mess of hassles and headaches. People are so different they can't get along. It's a mess of fragmentation out there. The freedom mentality that we experience at the Seder reminds us, once we've gotten to that place, we've blasted off far enough that we've escaped the magnetic pull of materialism, we look down and we see reality from God's perspective. And from God's perspective, both the bitter moments of life and the joyful moments of life are part of a symphony orchestrated by one conductor, singing and playing one melody. It's all coming from above. The bitter moments of life, the joyous moments of life, all wrapped in one sandwich. When we're free and we're connected with God and we're connected with our soul, there's no dichotomy, there's no compartmentalization. The spiritual and the physical, the mundane and the holy are all expressions of one divine energy and source. And that is a perspective, an attitude of freedom, of spirituality. The 11th step of the Seder is everyone's favorite, and that's the festive meal, Shulchan Aruch. So we start off, many people have the tradition of taking the egg that's on the Seder plate, opening it up, dipping it in the salt water. That reminds us traditionally to mourn even when we're celebrating, just as we break the glass under the chuppah when we're celebrating in Jewish marriage, we still break the glass to remind us before we shout Mazel Tov of the destruction, how we're still unfortunately in exile and there's still suffering in the world. And the idea of celebrating and eating food, even though we're celebrating something spiritual, so why would we celebrate with something so tangible and physical and mundane, is because true freedom is not when we are running from slavery and not looking back. True freedom is when we can turn around and elevate and refine all the years, all the entire life that we lived until now, when that too can be elevated into the realm of holiness and the consciousness, the connection to the divine that we are now experiencing. So we don't run away from and prohibit ourselves from partaking and enjoying in the physical world, the physical pleasure of eating a good meal of brisket and matzah ball soup and tzimmis and all the delicious kugels that are prepared for Passover by our wonderful Jewish mothers, but we actually deliberately partake and enjoy because it's all about realizing from this new perspective and plateau how the material and the physical are really all one. We finish the festive meal. We retrieve the afikomen from the children. We gotta do a good bargain with them. And we have our dessert. What's our dessert? And this is the last thing that we will taste till we retire and go to bed, and that's the afikomen, the matzah. The matzah of the afikomen is actually in place of the paschal lamb, which we no longer can offer and we don't eat. We don't eat the shenkbon, but we do eat the matzah of the afikomen, the larger half, which represents freedom. We eat that in place on a full stomach, just as they did in the first Exodus and during temple times. They ate the korban pesach, the paschal lamb, on a full stomach. And the root of the Hebrew word safon, which is the name for this stage, this step of Passover, of the Passover Seder, the 12th step, means hidden. Hidden, something that's really deep. You have, of course, a body. We all have a soul. We talk about the body and the soul, but then we have a level of consciousness, a place deep inside of us that's hidden, and that's the essence of the soul. The soul can be compared to the light, but here we're talking about the source of light. That space inside of us that is unleashed at the Passover Seder, now that we've come face to face with the true us, which is our beautiful and pure neshama and soul. We fill up the third cup in the 13th step. It's called Berach. We do the grace after meals. We make the blessing, Borei Pri Hagafen, after the grace of meals, which again reminds us of the idea of gratitude. A free person, grateful. You had a good meal, you thank God. The 14th step, we're just one away from the end. The 14th step is called Holo. We fill up the fourth cup to be drunk, we're going to drink that soon, to be drunk soon, that too. And we also fill up another cup, which we don't drink, which is called Elijah's cup. And we recite the Hallel, which is verses of praise to God written by King David in the book of Psalms, because to be free is to meditate, to pray, to be in touch with reality, to be in touch with the author of reality. And that's something that takes daily affirmation. Every day we wake up, we're not in that mind space. So we have to reaffirm that we are on the same wavelength and in tune with the divine perspective, that we are here to carry out God's will as opposed to God's here to carry out our will. Ask not what God can do for you. A free person thinks to themselves, what can I be of service of to God and to my fellow human today? And we also open the door for Elijah, as is Jewish law. And so we ask God, just as you've asked us to open our doors, please open your doors. And indeed, on Passover, the evening of Passover at the Seder, the mystics, the Jewish Kabbalists teach us that we have access to the greatest blessings one can ask for. We ask God, open your doors, open your gates. So it's a very apropos time to ask for personal blessings as well. Again, not for us. We don't need blessings. We have no needs. But wouldn't it help us to serve God if we had a little bit of livelihood, if we had some food, if we had good relationships? It's not for us. It's so that we can enhance and further our relationship and our service for God. Finally, we have the 15th step, and that is nirtza. Nirtza means our prayers have been accepted. We've done our part. The rest is up to God. Every mitzvah that we do, every good deed that we do adds a little bit of light to this world. And collectively, over the course of millennia of Jewish history and of human history, the amount of goodness, the amount of godliness that's been achieved and generated in this world through us doing mitzvot, through us doing God's will, it's mind-boggling. And slowly, through our collective good deeds and all the light that we add to this world, the spiritual energy, the scales will finally be tipped, and God will usher in an era of peace, of tranquility, of joy, of no jealousy, of good health, resurrection of the dead, the rebuilding of the temples. And that's what we pray for on page 21, where we sing next year in Jerusalem, which has been the call and the motivation for our ancestors through all the tsaras throughout the years. Next year in Jerusalem. My friends, l'chaim, may we indeed celebrate this year in Jerusalem.